Okay, let's go ahead and get started. My name again is Monica Huntsberry. I am here with Chanel Reynolds, and we have an amazing conversation today in store for you. If I can just take a moment to give you a little bit of background about Chanel, and there's a lot, so bear with me, I'm reading here, but Chanel learned from firsthand experience that most of us in the country are living one accident or illness away from financial ruin. She founded the internationally acclaimed Get Your Shit Together website to help other people take care of estate planning tasks to be less screwed when life goes sideways. She's been featured in the New York Times, NPR, CNBC, BBC, and has reached millions of people worldwide with her unique approach. Chanel, it is so great to be in conversation with you, and you are next door to me here in Seattle practically. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, I can wave to you here and then also from, 2 miles as the bird flies. Yes, it's so wonderful to be here. Thank you so much, Monica and Joni and Revel 11 team for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here today. Thank you.
That's awesome. And as we get started, Chanel and I are going to have a conversation, but what's really critical and important to us is to have it be relevant to what your burning questions are. So feel free to type questions that you have in the chat. We might ask for your comments from time to time. We certainly want this to be interactive and relevant for all of you. But first, when we get started, I just want to share for a moment is I picked up a copy of What Matters Most, and this is Chanel's book. And as you can see, I have lots of tabs on here, and I cannot recommend it enough to our audience. And Chanel, one of the things I want to share with you is that, I picked up this book thinking it was going to give me a list and all these tactical tips about making sure I had things in order. I'm a little bit of a control freak as it is. And so I thought, oh, this is good. I can become even more buttoned up. And while there were really practical tips, guides, step-by-step things for me to do that really were tangible and made sense, what I also found that surprised me was a beautiful and poignant story about loss and how you weaved in your personal story with why this topic is so relevant and applies to all of us. And I just want to thank you for your vulnerability and honesty and the way that you share that makes this tough topic something that feels close. And so with that, do you want to kick off with a little bit about why this is such a passionate topic for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and thank you for your note about the book. It always makes me feel like all of those fights with my editor were worth it about weaving in the story and the practical and the tactical and the emotional. So when we talk about personal finance, it's often not very personal. And the way I came to this work was because the work found me, really 12, 13 years ago. My late husband and I were a very typical growing family that looked like all of you have perhaps once in your life, or your neighbor or your coworker or your daughter or your mother. And, we were a growing family. We just stretched to buy a big home in Mount Baker in the Seattle area. We were both kind of doing that, like you pick up and I drop off, and who's got food and who's got the morning meeting and the later meeting, and the cacophony of all the things we'd wanted. And we were also writing things pretty thin, right? Kind of redlining our financial and our emotional lives in a lot of way. And so when I was on, over at a friend's house a number of years ago for barbecue steak night, and somebody just put a martini in my hand to celebrate, Friday, I went to go get my phone to take a few pictures of my son, who was at that time 5 and doing some weird bonky smashy dance on the couch with some other kids. And I noticed that there were all these messages and voicemails from numbers that I didn't recognize. And my first inclination a long enough time ago was, when we first of all didn't have our phones on us like all the time, was to put it back in the bag. But something felt wrong, and something was very wrong. My late husband had been in an accident. People couldn't find me. He'd been taken to Harborview, which is the place that the helicopters land on, not often the place you go to if you break a leg. And during a week in the ER and then the ICU, it was my story, and it was all of those small, very personal, overwhelmingly vulnerable moments that made me realize that I didn't have my shit together. And if that was happening to me, what's happening to everybody else in all of the other rooms in the lobby and in all of the other hospitals and homes, and that we're not very prepared to weather a hard time or a big storm in many cases.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's
Wow.
me. Hi. Sorry. little intense, but yeah, so it really was the personal story. Like we have, I had all of those books, which is the 8 ways to maximize your life, or rule this, or but I also realized through all those moments that I had a lot of information about my gluten intolerance and what kind of foods I should eat and how many calories I was eating or where the best yoga instructor was, but I had no idea what my interest rate was on my credit card. We were underprepared for some of the basic things that I knew. So what's the deal with me and my procrastination, especially given that I was smart, I was college educated, I'm native English speaking, I was legally married. I had a number of reasons why I shouldn't. I was a project manager, for the love of everything holy, and I still couldn't kind of project manage some of the basic things, like having our wills done. They actually were done, but they were sitting in my inbox complete, and they had been for months unsigned, and a number of other really easy basic things that we all tend to avoid or put off on our personal risk reward timeline, So I wanted to share the shit that made a difference for me, that I had, that was life-saving in a lot of ways, like very dry, boring things like some life insurance and a solid community of friends. And that the things that I wish I would have had, that really that crushed me, that took hundreds of hours instead of a few hours or dozens of hours to manage. For example, I'm pretty sure my late husband bought Bitcoin a long time ago, and I have no idea how to access that. So I could have flown all of us here to meet in person in helicopters, perhaps, but I don't know. So stuff like that, Yeah.
You talk about putting a tough situation forward for good. And I know it has not been an easy road. And again, I appreciate how you have had so much awareness in the process that has bled into this mission of yours to impact the lives of others. And certainly you're doing that. Maybe you kind of touched on it a little bit. I'd love to start with probably a very basic question, which is, with all that you know now, why do you think that you and so many people out there don't have their shit together?
Yeah, such a good question. The $1 million question, really.
Yeah. What's the why behind it, right?
Yeah, what's the why behind it? I think that there's a few reasons, many reasons, and a handful of them probably touch all of us in some ways. We don't necessarily have this kind of getting your shit together curricula, the wills, the life insurance, the emergency plans, kind of baked into our education process in some ways. There's some personal finance, but a lot of that is about building wealth, generational wealth, protecting wealth, which is a really nice thing to have and to fall back on when everything else gets really hard. So some of it is we just don't know what to do. I think some of it is that we don't really have many of us don't have a comfortable childhood or familiarity. We haven't grown up in a culture that talks about death, that sees death, that plans for death. We frequently say, if I die rather than when I die. So it's the one thing that we have in common, us humans, is that one day we won't be here anymore. And there's a book written a number of years ago called The Denial of Death. And so there's lots of talk about how we might be in denial about this kind of most obvious thing in front of our face. I think we're busy. And I think that it's overwhelming. We don't know what to do. We don't know what the most important thing is to do. And we don't want to make the wrong choice. So often we don't do anything and kind of cross our fingers that and hope for the best. And it turns out hoping for the best is not a plan. And rather than patching together small little things, it's much easier to sit down for 5 minutes a week or a month or half a day once a year, and kind of like getting a mammogram and cleaning out the, I don't know, changing the oil in your car or your furnace filters. It's just some maintenance that makes everything else work better and our lives better. So things don't end up blowing up, or when they do, we don't have to search through our files trying to find this thing when we're trying to listen to what the doctor's telling us. So it's a lot of reasons, but I think a lot of it is we just don't know. We don't like not knowing. And there's information all over the place, right? So when we're talking about getting our shit together, it's about us and our values and our fears and our plans or our finances, but we're all different and we all care about different things. We all prioritize different things. Like for me, let's say I have aging parents out of state and I'm worried about them. For other people, they are solo parents and they really need to establish guardianship. And so doing the right thing and then having to talk to an attorney and then talking to a financial person and then talking to somebody about insurance and then talking to somebody else or figuring out how to manage your like 1,000 passwords and then talk to somebody else about medical advocacy. It's a lot of stuff to do when really we're trying to shore up and tighten up our own home and lives and families and communities. But we end up having to talk to like 8 different people who may give us conflicting advice. And it's easier to just go watch like the new Game of Thrones show, you know? Oh, you're on mute, or else my things aren't working. No.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. I was saying you said a lot there, and I want to unpack some of that.
Thank you.
And then I again want to encourage the audience to jump into the chat with questions. Robin said truth, right? And I think it's also in the pages of your book. You have lots of quotes from people that have sent you messages. So I think the first part of this is, if you feel overwhelmed or you know you've been in denial or you don't have your stuff in order here, first of all, you're not alone, and you don't have to carry shame about that. That's what struck me from some of the quotes in your book, how many people were carrying shame and guilt, but that shame and guilt was keeping them locked in, partially because they didn't have permission or space to talk about it, which you've offered now. And also, as you said before, they didn't have the vernacular for it because it's not something we learn in school. It's not something we talk about at dinner parties. It's going to be the depressing guest, right? And so first of all, just acknowledging that it's okay and you're not alone and you don't have to carry shame. And second of all, I think one of the things you really do is help people gain some vernacular and break it down.
Absolutely.
So somebody comes to you in that place of overwhelm and maybe they say, I haven't done anything, or, I have an outdated will or whatever. Like, what is the first place that you direct them to get started?
Yeah, thank you. So over the years, I started with a checklist, and I know that sounds a bit in opposition to what I was talking about, everything being emotional, but I was so overwhelmed. And in that week in the hospital, it wasn't just, do you have your wills done and what's your disability insurance plan? And that was part of the hundreds of things that were screaming around in my head. But it was also sitting down with the palliative care and hospice people and them asking me what quality of life meant like for my husband, and hearing, which was his injuries were unrecoverable. And after a week in the ICU, the only option that I knew he would want would for me to remove medical support. And that is annihilating. It was a gift I could give him, not the one perhaps he wanted for his birthday, but it was what I could do, and I know it was what he wanted. He would not have wanted to be in an unrecoverable state for any longer. And my allergic reaction, I'd say, to being vulnerable was just blown over by the circumstances. And I was more vulnerable than I'd realized. And not only in the hospital that first day and that whole week, and in conversations at home, and the friend who was walking my dog, and the other friend who was helping with, taking my son to the Lego store to distract him for 2 minutes, was dozens and dozens and dozens of people in the hospital. Literally, I'm like sitting over my husband's bed with 1,000 tubes going in and out, and they're like, "We don't have our shit together either." And I'm like, "I know, maybe not here, but yes." And at the funeral, and for the weeks after, and the years after, and I would sit at home with a glass or two of wine late at night after I got my son to bed and Google, what do you do after someone dies? And 12, 13 years ago, there were not very many answers. And thankfully, there are so many more people having these conversations like today, and providing more resources to figure out what to do. But I could find one brochure from the AARP, something else for widows from like the military, and one or two other very unhelpful things. So I didn't know what to do. And I felt, for somebody who is resilient as hell, like one of those, grew up in the 70s, 80s, and I'd never ask for help. I'd rather peel my skin off and light it on fire than ask somebody for help. That's like how Midwestern I am, which I'm not proud of, but is true. I had to ask for help, and I had to accept help. And so it's really because I was so overwhelmed and I didn't know what to do first. I didn't know what the important stuff was, that I had to take everything in my head and put it down to literally a 2-page checklist. It was kind of the Atul Gawande checklist manifesto, beacon of light. And for me, it was how to put my life back together again, not how to keep the plane up. And it worked, and it was helpful. And other people were like, "Oh, what's that high level stuff that I need to pay attention to?" And so when I first launched the Get Your Shit Together website, which was a 10-page like typo, and like a proofreader should have had a peek at it. Let me just put it that way. I launched it out into the world on Facebook. It spread. And then the next day, the New York Times called and said, "Please, can I fly out here and interview you? And would you, by the way, not talk to the Wall Street Journal in the meantime?" I was like, okay. And then that weekend, millions of people went to the site. It was the most read, most shared, most whatever article of the whole weekend. And I have to tell you, and this is dating myself, that there was like a little picture of my head, and then a little picture of Woody Allen, who is a pedophile, and then under that, Lindsay Lohan does porn. And so many of my friends were like, "Dude, your story is more interesting than Lindsay Lohan does porn." And it's because there was a 2-page checklist that everyone downloaded so quickly it almost crashed the site. And my story is all of our stories, right? Like what happened to us probably won't happen to you, but things happen, and we need to, and we should, if and when hard times come to us and life goes sideways, it's so much better to have some answers prepared ahead of time. And so for me, I had to take the overwhelm down of the or of all the lists of things that I've heard over the years that I should do, and bring it down to a few emotional, practical, and tactical things, because that's the only thing my grief brain could handle. So this 2-page checklist, which I would love to share with you all, got me on a path that wasn't too cavernous. And I kept trying to remind myself, I can only do 5 or 10 minutes of stuff a day because I'm an emotional wreck. My life is on fire, and my son wants to watch Scooby-Doo, and I need to make pancakes. So what's emotionally the most important thing that's going to make me feel better, or going to help me not continue feeling bad? Tactically, what's something I have control over and can do? There are many things that I was afraid of. anything from zombie apocalypse to whatever. And many of the things that kept me up at night and screamed in my brain, I couldn't do anything about. So if it wasn't something I could tactically do, I had to throw it in the fuck it pile instead of the important list. And, practically, I was now or then a 39-year-old solo widowed parent of a 5-year-old who was about to go into kindergarten and a middle school aged stepdaughter. And there were some basic keep the oxygen level high things I had to do very practically to make sure that I had a whole new will set up. And I had 3 levels of guardianship because I was a solo parent. And if something happened to me, that was terrifying. I was also afraid of dying, but I was afraid of what would happen to my son who would be parentless if I died. And so that was emotionally one of my most important things. I would say for the few years after my late husband died, I was probably one of the best insured people in all of Washington state. Like, give me all the insurance. If anything happens, my son is going to be fine. He'll have enough money for as much therapy as he wants for the rest of his life. So I had to keep it about me and what was important to me and what would make me feel better, what would make me less vulnerable, and what I could actually manage. And take the advice, but filter it through. You need this, you need this, you need this, you need this, because there's a lot of noise out there about what you should do. And while that may not be wrong, it's probably not the most important thing to you. So one person had actually said, "Oh, you're kind of like the Aaron Brockovich of estate planning." And I said, yes, I will take that, because we need to be able to kind of flip that dynamic from we have to go to all of these different professionals to ask them what we should do with our lives, and then we're supposed to do everything they tell us, to here's who I am and what my family needs and what I need to feel safe and comfortable and protected, or more protected, if or when something happens, right? So my priorities shifted a lot from a growing married family to a solo parent who needed then to really protect my butt and my family's butt in a really different way.
So so what you're saying is 2 things. One is there was this whole awareness of where you hadn't been prepared when you lost your husband. And then the second phase of, with that new awareness, what you needed to do to protect yourself and your family going forward. And so you're learning from both of those experiences is what built into the platform that you have today to help others.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for taking that 5 minutes and making it more
No,
concise.
I appreciate I think all of our audience appreciates the context. And we're certainly having some conversations in the chat around some ideas. For those of you who aren't in the chat, Laura said, she had paid her attorney, but hadn't responded with the changes. And it's the nudge
Right.
she needed. And I know you have a story related to that too, where you had papers in your inbox that had not been executed. So for those of you who have already taken that first step to meet with the attorney or estate planner, congratulations. We encourage you to complete it. But at the same time, why is that? Why is it that somebody takes that first step and then doesn't go through the cycle? Or do you have practical tips for helping somebody complete something they started? Let's start with that. And then let's go to the getting started with some practical.
Yeah, definitely. Well, there are getting your shit together is something. There are usually 2 kind of main categories of reasons why this is top of mind. There are milestones, life milestones, like getting married, having children, buying a home, getting divorced, getting ready to retire, life changes, like these milestones that are often celebrated, that they have cards made for. Then there are also the triggers, the things that happen. Somebody, and there's actually, if you're familiar, many of us are with John Gottman, the relationship kind of guru and coach. He talks about the 4 horsemen of relationships, the 4 signs that something is wrong in your relationship. And I kind of have the 3 or 4 Ds of stuff that could go wrong in your life. So many of the triggers are death. Something happens, and it's either an earlier than expected death or a long, somebody dies at 157 with a gin and tonic in their hand and surrounded by their great grandchildren. There's divorce. Divorce, especially for women, can be financially. Women are often have their financial standing goes down, or their financial security can go down during a divorce. There's diagnosis. So if or when we get an illness or a diagnosis for an illness, people who have a cancer diagnosis, one that you can recover from completely, are twice as likely to declare bankruptcy. And some kind of disaster. So death, disease, divorce, and disaster. These are these triggers that can come up and really destabilize us and our families and our households and our finances. So I think about what are the things that I'm planning, the big milestones in my life that I want to celebrate and walk into and walk towards with big happy eyes, and be able to be prepared for getting married or a second marriage. What does that look like? And how do you and your new partner set up a household that's going to be, in sickness and in health, one that can support you if or when something happens? And for those unexpected moments where life might go sideways, and those what if moments, I certainly am not going to suggest we all spend our time spinning and cycling about every possible thing that could go wrong. I find that to be not productive, and our worry brains are usually pretty active anyway. But for me, I had been recently widowed and now a solo parent. And sometimes people are widowed or widowers with or without, young children. And I found myself widowed and with a young child. Guardianship for my kids was important. My stepdaughter and my son, and keeping the family together, that was the most important thing. If I died, and if something happened to me and I got sick or injured but didn't die, what would happen then? And so then that would be, let's say, disability insurance. So I think about these what ifs. What are the top 2 or 3 things that I see or I'm planning for on the horizon? And what are the top 1 or 2 things that either for hereditary or genetic reasons, let's say you have a family that has a history of back surgeries. Every single person in your family has had a back issue and back surgery. It makes sense to plan for how to weather that time well. And then also for me, I think about, as a now 50 plus year old person with young adult children, my life milestone and what I'm personally worried about or impacted about, and what I want to prioritize, these top 2 or 3 things are, right now I'm redoing my wills as well, because my little teeny baby schmoopy kids are now young adults, legal adults, we'll put it that way. So it's what's important to you, and what are the things that you're looking forward to and want to plan for, to be able to make that time more joyous and less risky or vulnerable or scary feeling. And then also, what are those what if moments? And that's, we live in earthquake country. And so very frequently when people are like, hi, we don't have our shit together and we need your help figuring out what to do first, I'll ask, what's on your mind? What's working for you right now? What are the things that are important to you? And what are the, what brought you here? And often I'll start with the earthquake preparedness, because it's a nice neutral thing to do. And what that can cover is emergency phone contact lists. Who are the people in your life that you would want to be able to contact, or where do you have an extra key? Do you know where your family's prescriptions are and medication? Do you have a, in case of emergency, app? So I start with what happens if something happens, and then those plans can really quickly be taken out timeline wise another year or another few years. So what happens if something happens now? Very neutral things that may be out of our control, like an earthquake, and that could be What are the things that you'd want to have or don't have right now to keep life moving for 24 to 48 hours? And that's anything from somebody being on your emergency contact list to somebody else being able to pick up a kid from school to a neighbor having a key to let your dog go out or take your dog for a walk so it doesn't pee on the floor and eat your couch, let's say. And then what happens if something happens and that keeps on happening? You're in the hospital for a week, or somebody is injured and it takes a couple weeks or a couple of months. What are those things that you would want to have available to you that you can imagine? And then you can kind of set that up for yourself so they're ready for you. So you're not running around scrambling, trying to find a password to a bank account when that's something you could take 5 minutes and to do now. So you're leaving yourself breadcrumbs for the future.
Okay, so a lot of this is just about considering those unique situations and then creating preparedness, right? And there can be, we know as project planners and managers, there can be a decision tree attached to everything, which is sometimes why I think the topic feels overwhelming. If anybody has worked with an estate planner, part of the challenge of a will and why people don't complete it, I think, is because you have to create so many decisions and so many what ifs, and what if this person isn't available in that, and the scenarios you might lose people or lose track of all the things you do, and it just is like feels overwhelming, so it goes in a bucket. So I think there are some questions in the chat that we should see if we can address some of them and maybe talk about some of the tactical steps as well.
Yeah.
But one of the questions that was initially on our list to address today is, what is the best way to store, share a will or important documents once they are done? Can you give us a recommendation on that?
Yeah, definitely. So there are a couple of kind of core or key or essential items that I think are foundational, critical things for all of us to have as adults and households to have. And getting that done, your basic legal stuff, and that's a will, a power of attorney document, and your advanced care directive or living will. Those are the kind of core decisions and designations most people make in any kind of legal document, whether it's a giant trust or a basic will. There are some guardianship of children and pets and who you want your money and stuff to go to. So your basic legal documents are one of these important foundational pillars. Money and insurance, I find that those are a bit of a complementary cycle, and they work together. So emergency plans to retirement savings and whatever you do or don't have enough of, what insurance do you have to help kind of fill those gaps or increase the size of your lifeboat? And that's, disability insurance, life insurance, and anything else. So your wills, your basic legal stuff, your basic financial state of the state, what insurance policies do you have? Do you have enough of the right kind? And how are you going to get this information done? So there's a couple and shared. So over half of US adults don't have their wills done. So we are all in good company because getting our shit together is a team sport. And so this is the first step towards making huge progress. Not having it done can be devastating. It can take wrapping up somebody's affairs that would take dozens, or I will honestly, and the truth is it takes about an average of a few hundred hours over the course of a year. There's a lot of phone calls and forms with, and I'm sorry for your lost apartment. Now, when you don't have some of these basic things done, that is essentially doubled, and it can take a couple of years and 400 hours. And on average, everybody who is, like, let's say an executor of somebody's estate is going to be making about a phone call for about an hour a day for the conceivable future. And that makes your life, you just don't want to be dealing with where's my money and how do I get it when you're trying to just hold the plane up. You know what I mean?
Right.
So having the documents done is critical. And then once you have them done, if no one can find them, they're not very helpful. So I like to have a backup plan, and I like to have 2 backup plans. So if you work with an estate planning attorney, definitely work with one who has experience in your state that you live in, your primary residence, and who has experience with estate planning. If your sister's an attorney, but she does like real estate law, she might be able to help you get started. But I definitely recommend, especially if you have specific questions, work with somebody who has experience in this specific area. And if you have questions about international citizenship, or you have property out of state, or you have, anything that might be a specific thing, elder care, or setting up a special needs trust. So somebody who needs additional care, that there's some more structure around that. So if you work with an attorney, frequently the attorney will hold those original signed documents for you. And in that case, that's not a bad thing to do. Ask that attorney what the succession plan is if they happen to retire or the company gets merged with somebody else. There are many stories of people who are like, oh, I had our neighborhood attorney do it. 10 years later, that person's retired, nobody can find the will, and they don't know where it is. So if you don't have the original, make sure you know where it is, and the people who need to get it know how to find it. If you don't use an attorney, which you're not legally required to, you can use an online template. There are a number of them that have been around for a long time, and it's like a TurboTax for your estate plans. They are getting more and more comprehensive. They often offer very basic things, and for some people, those are enough. And so then you would print out your will, you would sign it with 2 people. You can have it notarized. You're not legally required to have a will notarized for it to be legally binding, although everybody says it's a good idea, but you're not legally required to. So if that's a barrier, it doesn't have to be one. So, and if you're keeping the original copies of your will or your documents, or your IDs and your passport and your emergency contact list, or your external hard drive with all of your family photos on it, I recommend keeping it in a safe place at home. And you can purchase a waterproof, fireproof kind of zipper envelope, and if you don't have a safe, and keep it a little extra protected, and then have a few backups. And so the people who are listed on your documents, your kind of core A-team people, which would be, let's say, your executor, if you have guardianship, the person who's going to speak for you medically, let them have a copy. Make a few printouts and give those important people in your life, those important roles and designations, give them a printout copy. And I like to have a digital version up in the cloud. So if someone's traveling or not around, you can get a version of it and you can have access to it quickly if you're not right there, and then have a printout version distributed to some of those people. It may not be the original, and it doesn't have to be the original, but they are informed, they know how to get a hold of each other, and that those core people, those core 1 or 2 or 3 people, know where your original documents are. And they kind of have the phone tree, right? Like the if something happens phone tree. And so they know who to contact, and they know what that person's role or designation is, and they know where to get the original document. So I'm a big fan of backups. And if you have a double backup, something digital and analog, it can really help cover your bases.
That's great. Chanel, we have about 15 minutes left, and there's a lot of questions too. So I want to kind of get really tactical now with some of this.
Yeah.
One of the important questions I think that came up in the chat is, what about all your passwords, access to your phone, access to your accounts? What is your recommendation for people to access your password in case of emergency, and also somebody other than just your spouse too?
Yes, I'm so glad that came up. So how do we get stuff? So most of us have over 100 online accounts, and many of us do paperless billing and auto pay. And so much of our financial and personal lives is online now. And so a couple of things when it comes to password managers, I love them personally. Many people use them. There are a number of them which all offer kind of similar services, and there are free versions. LastPass is one that a developer friend of mine started using a number of years ago, and I've just been using that. 1Password and Dashlane are other password managers that have been around for a while and are well regarded. I use them because I don't remember even my Netflix password, much less everything else, and I can't keep different, safe, kind of hard to hack passwords in my head. And so using a password makes it much easier for me to manage my day-to-day life. And I can also give somebody access, very trusted people, access in case of an emergency to where my passwords are. And that makes me feel better. So if something happens, there's an emergency plan, and my brother, who would be one of my trusted A-team people, could open up and see the list of here's where all Chanel's stuff is and how to access it. I have a digital power of attorney. It's a newer thing. 10 years ago, people weren't really doing it, but your digital assets are not, they have not historically been seen to be the same kind of property, let's say, as like the jewelry or rugs or something, the lamp in your house. And so having a digital power of attorney, this additional designation in your legal documents that gives somebody an extra step to say, I'm somebody's digital power of attorney. So Flickr or Netflix or the cell phone or somebody, that company is then more likely and legally required to then talk to somebody on your behalf. Because it used to be like, you know, social media accounts. There were so many stories about people wanting to get them turned back on or turned off on behalf of somebody who had died. And it was more complicated than it needed to be, for sure. Now, I'll also say the best system to use is the one that you're going to use. So I spent so much time trying to set up a password manager on my parents' computer at home. I would fly out there and I'd leave instructions, and I hired somebody who wasn't me, like a concierge, to walk them through it, and they still wouldn't do it. But what they did do was, you know, it's that kind of like, I come from a Post-it note family. So there were a ton of Post-it notes, and anytime my parents would get a new account for anything, they'd write it down on a Post-it note. They'd open up their little book. You know, they had a lot of books. My dad was a big book guy, and put it back in the bookcase. And we knew literally all of their passwords to everything. And so is like a CISO or a super tech person going to be like, oh, I love your Post-it note plan for keeping track of passwords? No, probably not. But I spent zero time after my father died in the spring flying out to Minnesota, and my mother had a one-sheet list of where all the accounts were, and we had usernames and account passwords to all of their accounts, and it was organized and updated. We did not spend what many people do, and what I find and try to help people do, which is spend hours and hours and hours kind of doing a forensic review of somebody's computer or email, looking for accounts, looking for receipts, looking for invoices, looking for policies. So whatever the system is that works for you, do that. But having a system is life-saving, and it has been life-saving, and it makes sure that the stuff you don't want to be lost isn't lost.
Right.
And the stuff that needs to be found can be easily found.
I think that's really important. I love that. Have a system you're going to use, and it will save you a lot of time. So back to those 1Password or LastPass or etc. Who do you share your password with to access that?
So that is up to you. I mean, you are giving somebody the keys to your account. So often it's somebody, if you have shared finances with anybody, if you're married or frequently, you know, you and your spouse should know where your assets are and whose name is on them. So if you have shared finances with somebody, you definitely want to do a review. And there are a couple ways to make this kind of managing passwords, like, Netflix and auto pay for services is one thing, but and I saw in the chat, one thing that I highly, highly encourage everyone to do, it can take 5 minutes per account, is to update your beneficiaries, name and or update your beneficiaries, because that can remove a lot of time and hassle and effort to get and to designate who you want to get whatever it is, from your retirement account to the savings account with $10 in it. So you can go online and you can update, generally name or update your beneficiary designation in your account online with each of your bank accounts, and that will save you and or your family members or beneficiaries like hundreds of hours potentially trying to figure out who gets what and when. So that's really important. For me, my partner has access to my password manager account, and that way they can go in if they need to and manage something on my behalf. They are my digital power of attorney, and that means they have access to my accounts. It can be tricky. So if you have questions about whether that feels right to you, or if you want them to have access to everything, you can also do access to some but not all things. If you want to keep your personal life personal, but you want somebody to have access to your 5 core accounts, you can set it up that way also. And sometimes that takes a little bit more work, but it doesn't have to be all or nothing. And then my brother, who lives out of state, I have him set up with emergency access. So if something happens to me and something really happens to me, he would then have access, but can't just on any day like poke into my accounts and see like what my balance is anywhere. So you can set up levels of access to everything, to some things, or only an emergency. And some password managers will do that. As a backup, designate somebody as your digital power of attorney in your power of attorney document, and they would be able to then go to each of those individual financial institutions or accounts and follow up on your behalf if they needed to.
Okay, that's helpful. Okay, I have 2 more questions I want to get to, and we have 10 minutes. So we'll maybe have to keep it a little bit high level, but I think these are 2 important questions. Somebody in the chat wrote about having a parent that they had lost, not getting along with the other parent, struggling with how to resolve, dissolve, an estate when family relationships are challenging. Again, you can't solve for that on this call and in a couple of minutes, but are there resources that you might point that individual to?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. It's one of the things about getting your shit together is it can take the number of things to worry and wonder or stress about down, but it doesn't take away the fact that when you lose someone, it's hard, and death and dying and recent loss, deep grief doesn't always bring out the best in people. And so sometimes, friendships are challenged, and sometimes family relationships are surprisingly like set adrift or become very, very stressful. So if somebody is having a hard time managing an estate after somebody dies, and there is disagreement in the family, which happens frequently, anything from somebody coming over and taking the lawnmower out of a garage the day after someone dies. If I had $1 for every time I heard that story, I'm like, what is it with lawnmowers? But all of a sudden people are like, this person said I could have it, so I'm just going to take it and go. And you're like, we're not even at the funeral yet. So it happens so much, and I'm so sorry for any time in the past or future where you're like, people just kind of went bonkers on you. There are like fiduciary services. Either your bank, more and more banks have a kind of like a legacy department now, and so somebody there can often guide or walk you through what happens after something happens and what your rights really are as somebody who's been named in a will, or or if not, what happens if somebody dies intestate, which means they don't have a will. There are also smaller or independent companies that offer these kinds of like probate help or insurance, legal groups. If you find a group that does family law, that often means they can specialize in probate. This is an issue for a lot of people. So talk to an attorney who can help you navigate that probate path, or somebody who can act as an independent fiduciary and do things like get certified copies of the death certificate and help you navigate walking through things. So if you are having a hard time, which happens, and I'm sorry, generally any good attorney, if you reach out and talk to one or two or three, most will give you a 15 or 30-minute free consult. Find somebody who works in family law or a law firm that does estate planning and probate specific, and ask them to ask if they could be the right person for you. And if they are not, there are also some social services or state guidelines to help you navigate that process. And or you can help perhaps get a like an independent person to come help facilitate that. But grief and loss is hard, and navigating probate sucks. So I would absolutely recommend somebody reach out to an attorney who specializes in this. And there might be a lot of steps involved, but it might be a lot simpler and easier to walk through and resolve if you have somebody who just understands the language and the process. So definitely reach out for help. There are people who are out there as independent folks doing this. If anybody has questions, I work with people all over the country who help with probate. There's another group called Easy Probate, and they've merged with Trust and Will. I talked with the founder of that company a few years ago. And so there are resources out there. I'd be happy to help point you in the right direction. You do not have to like do those late night Googles at 2 a.m. wondering what the hell you're going to do because your sister's decided to like take the lawnmower, for example.
Yeah, well, and we're certainly getting a lot of response to this in the chat. I think people are attesting that they've spent hundreds, even 700 hours on, trying to manage through an estate. So I think for me, the message is twofold. One is it's important to have my affairs in order so that my children don't have to go through that same thing if something were to happen to me. So that's again, a motivation. But if it's already happened to you, unfortunately, and either your parents or somebody close to you left you in a state that you're trying to manage through, I think what you said, Chanel, is to ask for help and make sure you have the right legal team. Even with that, it can still be challenging and frustrating and hard. There are a lot of bureaucracy and systems, so we don't mean to simplify it, but I love also that your website is a great resource and that you personally might also be a good resource. And we will be sending out a recording of this with follow up on how to get in touch with Chanel after the call. I think we have to wrap here in just one minute, but one of the other comments that were coming in were around, well, part of my struggle is I'm not sure who to impart this to because I don't have children or living relatives or, people that I want to give my assets to. But I think the question is, well, okay, and if you don't, then what happens, right?
Right. That's a great question. What happens if I don't have a will, or what happens if somebody doesn't have a will?
And there's no immediate family, I guess that
and
would
there's
be
no
called.
immediate family. Yeah, and sometimes people have immediate family and they want them to have nothing to do with their will, which is also possible. They're like, no one of my blood family are going to be poking into my closets for sure. There are people you can hire who offer these fiduciary services, executor. The title is executrix, which I'm like, I want to be that just because I want to have that on my business card. But you can hire somebody to do it, and it's a fee, and it would come out of your estate, or you would set up payment ahead of time. It would be like a legal clerk or somebody to do this. And I highly recommend that. Being an executor to somebody's estate can take hundreds of hours. in a best case scenario. It can be complicated. You could also set up a trust in advance to manage a lot of the financial and the asset stuff, and hire a bank or a fiduciary service to manage that trust for you. And then you would have a smaller amount of things to ask somebody else to do. You could also ask a friend or a not so close family member. You could make a trade with somebody else who you know who might be in your work community, your this morning community, your book club. Chances are that there's somebody else out there who may not have close family or isn't close to their family, and you guys could trade those services for each other and be that backup person for each other. So it certainly doesn't have to be your spouse, even if you're married. It doesn't have to be a family member, but if you do not designate that person or a person, the state is going to do it for you. And if nobody in your family who's the heir, according to the state, lines up, then the state will eventually assign somebody to manage it for you, but it's not going to go, chances are that it won't go the way you want it to. So friends, family, distant coworkers, or not distant coworkers, for, somebody who you think would do a good enough job. Like maybe they've always liked your car. So you can say, hey, if I die, you can have my car. Will you just do some admin work for me? And they'd be like, yeah, I totally want that car. So it doesn't have to be the obvious people. For example, my dear friend, who's a social worker and a no bullshit kind of woman, is my medical advocate, my living will, my advanced care directive. Somebody mentioned 5 wishes I saw. I'm sorry, I've been reading through the chat. Should I marry again? My friend Erin, the social worker, will remain my medical advocate to the end of time. So I don't want to necessarily ask a spouse to have to tell the doctors to turn the machines off. My friend Erin will turn those damn machines off. so it can be somebody who you might not assume is the default person to manage these things for you, and you can switch and be allies and backups and supports for each other. That's what we're here for.
That is really great insight and wisdom. And Chanel, I can tell by some of the conversation taking place in the chat that you've already made such an impact this morning to our Rebel 11 audience. I really thank you for showing up and sharing your story and why getting your shit together matters. I really can't encourage people enough to buy this beautiful book, What Matters Most. And again, we'll be sending out the recording